The year is 1182. A scorching morning dawned over the kingdom of Jerusalem. The air shimmered with heat and the grim anticipation of slaughter. In the shadow of the magnificent Belvoir castle, whose limestone walls towered nearly 500 feet above the valley, an army doomed to destruction prepared for battle. Leading this small band of men was King Baldwin IV. He was only 21 years old, but leprosy was already relentlessly consuming his body. His fingers were dying, and his numb hands, wrapped in silk to conceal the decay, could barely hold a sword. Witnesses said he had to be lifted onto his horse. He was a living ghost in the saddle, yet his mind remained as sharp as Damascus steel. His forces? A mere 750 knights, an elite contingent scraped together from every corner of his fractured kingdom, and 4,000 foot soldiers, hardened veterans, each one worth their weight in gold. Against them, stretching to the horizon, stood Saladin's relentless colossal army. This was the army of the legendary conqueror who had united Syria and Egypt. It numbered 30,000 elite warriors of Islam, including thousands of mounted archers capable of unleashing a storm of steel, formidable regular cavalry, and elite Mamluks, eager for blood and glory. Picture this, 40 to 1. This wasn't merely numerical superiority, it was absolute, overwhelming superiority. It was military suicide, a death sentence leaving no chance. Saladin's scouts, upon seeing the tiny Crusader army, initially laughed. How could he possibly hope to win? How could this handful possibly stand against such a mighty, unstoppable force? But by sunset on that brutal day, the laughter had died. 2,000 Muslim warriors lay dead on the blood-soaked ground, while the tiny Crusader army, whole and unharmed, stood its ground, having accomplished what any military treatise would have called utterly impossible. They had prevailed. This is more than just a story about a battle. It's a saga of how the genius of a dying king and the unprecedented iron discipline of his infantry rewrote the rules of medieval warfare. It's the story of the birth of the Iron Hedgehog, a revolutionary tactic that withstood Saladin's overwhelming storm. But paradoxically, this miraculous victory laid the insidious groundwork for the inevitable demise of his own kingdom. How could this have happened, and why did such a brilliant triumph prove to be a harbinger of ultimate catastrophe? It wasn't just a victory. It was an absolute shock, a blow that echoed throughout the Levant, forcing both Christians and Muslims to rethink everything they knew about warfare. How could a handful of warriors stand against an immense army and inflict such devastating losses? What happened at Belvoir is not just the story of a brutal battle where blood soaked the ground under the scorching sun. It is much more than that. It is the narrative of the birth of a new, revolutionary tactic that forever changed the face of medieval warfare, rewriting rules that once seemed unshakable. We'll see how sheer strategic genius, the mind of a dying king, ravaged by disease, can temporarily overcome even the most overwhelming numerical superiority, turning defeat into an incredible triumph. It's a lesson that even under the most desperate circumstances, discipline, innovation, and the will to win can work wonders. But behind this dazzling triumph lay a cruel, ruthless logic. The logic of economic warfare, which, like an invisible plague, ultimately doomed the victors themselves. We will reveal how, having won the battle, the Crusaders lost the war, falling into a treacherous strategic trap from which there was no escape. But to understand how this impossible victory became a reality and why, against all odds, it failed to save an entire kingdom, we need to rewind time. We must see how this fragile, burning Levant transformed into a powder keg, ready to explode from a single spark. Fragile peace. The year was 1180. The Holy Land, exhausted by decades of relentless wars, had fallen into a fragile temporary peace. A 2-year truce had been struck between the Christian kingdom of Jerusalem and Saladin's rapidly expanding Ayyubid empire. Both sides, weary from constant conflict, desperately needed a respite to heal their wounds and regroup their forces. This was a time when two titans stood on the brink. In the heart of the kingdom of Jerusalem reigned Baldwin IV, known as the Leper King. Though a devastating illness relentlessly consumed his body, turning the young man into a living legend, his mind remained sharp as a razor. At 19, he had already proven himself a brilliant and insightful tactician, capable of defeating even the most formidable adversaries. But his body was failing him even faster than his kingdom. Every morning was a battle, and each day was a step closer to his inevitable end. Across the battle lines stood his great rival, Saladin. Known as the Merciful Conqueror, he had achieved the extraordinary, uniting the fragmented Muslim emirates of Syria and Egypt under his rule, forging the powerful Ayyubid dynasty. While earlier Muslim leaders were consumed by internal conflicts, Saladin brought unity, enforced iron discipline, and instilled a clear objective: the reconquest of Jerusalem, the holy city that Christians claimed as their own. His empire grew, his influence spread, and the peace treaty he had made with the Franks was merely a tactical pause before the decisive push. Let's examine the sides and their motives, and the spark that ignited the conflict. But chronicles don't always tell the full story. The true catalyst for a new, devastating war was not religious animosity, but pure, unadulterated greed. At the heart of this powder keg was Reynald of Chatillon, Lord of Kerak. This odious knight, nicknamed the Mad Wolf of Kerak for his reckless cruelty, controlled vital trade routes between Damascus and Egypt. From his impregnable fortress of Kerak, he levied tolls, but his insatiable greed knew no bounds. In late 1181, cynically violating a truce, Reynald de Chatillon launched a brazen, reckless raid on a massive caravan traveling from Damascus to the holy city of Mecca. Among the travelers was even Saladin's own sister. The plunder was colossal, 200,000 dinars worth of goods, an astronomical sum for the era. When Saladin demanded compensation and the return of the captives, Reynald, according to chroniclers, merely laughed scornfully, declaring, "Let your Muhammad come and save them." This monstrous insult not only trampled the fragile peace, it shattered it completely. For Saladin, this was a personal humiliation and a direct challenge to the entire Islamic world. He immediately declared jihad, a holy war, summoning warriors from across his vast empire. By May of 1182, an incredible army of 30,000 men had assembled in Damascus. This was no mere militia. It comprised regular cavalry, deadly horse archers, detachments of volunteer jihadists, and, crucially, the elite Mamluks. These slave soldiers were the iron fist of the Islamic war machine. The stakes were nothing less than the life or death of the kingdom. The kingdom of Jerusalem stood on the edge of an imminent catastrophe. Despite all his determination, Baldwin could muster a mere 1,200 knights from all his domains. Most of these forces were scattered across isolated but strategically vital castles, stretching from modern-day Lebanon to the Red Sea. The kingdom's strength lay in its fortresses, but this was also its greatest weakness. By defending everything, it was strong nowhere. Its resources were catastrophically limited, and its army was incredibly small. At this critical and desperate juncture, Baldwin the Hertaki made an unthinkable, almost insane decision. He issued an order that shocked even his closest advisors: to deplete the garrisons of his castles, leaving only a bare minimum of defenders, and concentrate every available man into a single field army. It was a desperate, unprecedented move that could either be a stroke of genius leading to salvation, or a sure path to self-destruction. An imminent slaughter loomed. Saladin's 30,000 warriors were closing in on 750 knights. The stage was set for complete annihilation. But what compelled the dying king to take such a reckless risk? And how did he intend to defy Saladin's invincible might? The answer lay in a revolution in tactics that would be forged in the fire of this battle. The true formula for power, it turned out, wasn't simply found in steel. The strength of the Crusaders at the Battle of Belvoir wasn't just about their famous knights, clad in 80 pounds of heavy armor that cost an entire village. No, their true advantage lay in revolutionary tactics and the infantry's unprecedented, almost inhuman discipline. This army, though catastrophically outnumbered, with only 750 knights and 4,000 infantrymen facing 30,000 enemies, was comprised of hardened veterans who had been through the fire and water of constant border warfare. They were battered, but not broken. Their true advantage was rooted in their discipline, their tactics, and their logistics. Their discipline was born of desperation. These people demonstrated an absolute unwavering discipline, which became their steel shield. Unlike most medieval armies, they did not fall for the treacherous feigned retreats of the Turks, designed to lure them out of formation. Every warrior, from knight to simple pikeman, held their ground with a rock-like tenacity. Young knights, whose usual fervor might have driven them to pursue, gripped their reins until their knuckles turned white, but remained steadfast. This iron will to resist, born from the understanding that any breach of formation meant certain doom for the entire kingdom, was unbreakable. At the heart of their success was a revolutionary, previously unseen formation, which Latin chroniclers called Fious Ericus, or the Iron Hedgehog. Imagine a living fortress. 750 knights formed a steel core in the center and rear, poised for powerful counterattacks. Around them, 4,000 infantrymen created an impenetrable iron shell, bristling with 14-foot pikes. The gaps between the pikemen were filled by deadly crossbowmen, capable of piercing chainmail at a distance of 50 yards. This formation was not just a static wall, it was dynamic and flexible. It could bend, absorbing monstrous cavalry charges like a drawn bow, and then counterattack when sections of the wall suddenly opened, releasing knights in wedge formations to crush the enemy's disorganized infantry. Then the formation closed behind them like water. This was the ultimate art of combined infantry and cavalry work, centuries ahead of its time. And at the helm of this incredible machine was Baldwin IV himself. Even though he could barely stay in the saddle, and his hands were wrapped in silk to conceal the horrific ravages of his illness, his mind remained as sharp as Damascus steel. His decisions were insightful, bold, and decisive. He wasn't merely present, he personally directed the battle, even after his illness forced him from his horse. From the stretcher his bodyguards had lifted him onto, he continued to issue crucial commands. Hold the line, let them come to us. His unwavering will and tactical genius were the linchpin that held the entire army together. This presented a stark contrast with the enemy. Their strategy relied on mobility, while Baldwin's army held its ground like an unyielding fortress. Saladin's army, though impressively vast, comprising 12,000 devastating horse archers, 8,000 powerful regular cavalry, and 10,000 infantry, relied on traditional tactics that had brought them victories for centuries. Their strategy was built upon relentless barrages of arrows, swift harassing attacks, and deceptive feigned retreats, all designed to scatter and destroy the enemy piecemeal. Saladin's warriors were masters of mobility and fluid combat. Their cavalry could appear and vanish in an instant, unleashing a hail of arrows and executing lightning-fast charges. But at Belvoir, they encountered something entirely different. A moving fortress of steel and resolve. The Iron Hedgehog shattered all their expectations and rendered their traditional time-tested methods useless. Their mobility ran into an impenetrable wall. Their arrows were met with organized defense, and their feigned retreats were countered by unwavering discipline. It was a clash of two worlds, two philosophies of war, and one of them was bound to fall. But how did this incredible tactic actually look in action? What did the warriors feel as the ground trembled under the hooves of thousands of enemy horses and the sky darkened with a storm of arrows? To truly understand this, we need to place ourselves right there on the battlefield, under the scorching sun, in the shadow of Belvoir Castle. The battlefield was a hell under the sun. Imagine this day, the scorching morning of July 15th, 1182. Over the Jordan Valley, the sun isn't just shining, it's blazing, turning the air into a suffocating red-hot furnace. The heat is unbearable, draining strength, parching throats, and clouding minds. On this day, it will become as deadly an enemy as any sword. Foot soldiers, clad in heavy armor, drop dead, succumbing to sunstroke. Even Baldwin's standard-bearer, carrying the sacred True Cross, cannot endure. He collapses, struck down by the oppressive heat. Above the valley, like a stone giant, stood Belvoir Castle, or Kaukab al-Hawa, as the Arabs called it. Its impregnable limestone walls rose 500 feet above the surrounding landscape, controlling the vital route from Damascus to Jerusalem. Saladin, for all his immense power, could not bypass it. This castle was a strategic necessity, an unavoidable obstacle that forced his army into battle. The burning land and visible despair. But before the battle even started, the Crusaders went through a living hell. From the high castle walls, from their defensive positions, they witnessed a horrifying panorama. Saladin's Muslim raiders, like packs of wolves, swept through the valley, systematically burning Christian villages. The Crusaders watched as black, ominous plumes of smoke rose high into the sky. 60 villages, their homes, their crops, their very future, all were being reduced to smoldering ash. This was brutal, relentless economic warfare. Every column of smoke meant lost tax revenue, fewer recruits, and dwindling supplies. The sight filled them with unbearable terror and despair, watching their lands bleed from 1,000 small wounds. But at the same time, it also forged a steely resolve. They saw what they were losing and understood what they were fighting for. Women and children, fleeing the flames, sought refuge within Belvoir's walls, and their silent fear was a powerful motivator for the warriors. The first wave, a storm of chaos. And now the pivotal moment is upon us. Feel it. The ground literally starts to tremble beneath your feet, not just shaking, but vibrating from the thunderous, relentless pounding of thousands upon thousands of hooves. It's Saladin's 8,000 Muslim horsemen preparing for their first devastating attack. Look to the horizon. The dust cloud from their march was visible from 20 miles away. Now it looms over you, obscuring the sun and painting the sky a sinister, blood-red hue. Hear this. The piercing cries of thousands of horses merging into a single soul-rending roar, the clang of steel against wood as the riders' spears lower, preparing for impact. The vanguard of 500 Mamluks, Islam's elite and most formidable heavy cavalry, slams into the Crusader line at full gallop. It's a wall of flesh and steel thundering towards you. But then the unthinkable happens. The infantry line, the Iron Hedgehog, doesn't break or crumble in panic. Instead, it bends back like a tightly strung bow, absorbing this monstrous, crushing blow. You can hear pikes snapping with a crack, men screaming in pain and strain, and horses rearing, wild with pain and resistance. Yet the line holds. It is unyielding. It has endured. This was just the first blow, and it didn't break them. What will happen next when the true carnage begins? The setup, birth of the Hedgehog. Dawn broke over Belvoir. The first rays of sun painted the castle walls golden as Baldwin's army, tiny but determined, descended from the heights. What Saladin's scouts saw shocked them. All principles of Crusader tactics had been broken. Instead of knights charging ahead and infantry struggling to keep up, the entire force moved as a single monstrous organism. This was the Iron Hedgehog, or Fious Ericus. In the center and at the rear were 750 knights, a steel spring ready for a devastating strike. Around them stood 4,000 infantrymen, forming an impenetrable iron shell bristling with 14-foot pikes. Stationed between the pikemen were deadly crossbowmen, whose bolts could pierce chainmail from a distance. This was not merely a defense, it was a living, breathing fortress. The first move was a rain of arrows. Then all hell broke loose. Saladin's 12,000 mounted archers unleashed an endless rain of arrows upon the Crusaders. The sky darkened with a cloud of feathered projectiles. This was a standard, time-tested tactic that had crushed countless armies by showering the enemy with arrows while remaining out of reach. But then physics entered the equation. The Crusaders raised their shields in perfect unison, creating an overlapping solid shell. Arrows designed to pierce chainmail at 50 yards lost most of their killing power at the 200-yard distance favored by the mounted archers. This impenetrable wall of shields completely broke their centuries-old strategy. The ground literally trembled as 8,000 Muslim horsemen prepared for their first probing attack. Their commander, Emir Muzaffar al-Din, was an experienced warrior who had broken many Christian armies. He was scanning for weaknesses, for panic, for any sign that their discipline might falter. The first blow struck like thunder. 500 Mamluks, the elite vanguard of Islam, slammed into the Crusader line at a full gallop. It was a blow of tremendous power, but then something happened that changed everything. Instead of shattering, the infantry lines simply bent back like a taut bow, absorbing the full impact. Pikes splintered, men cried out, and horses reared in agony, but the line held firm. As the Muslim cavalry pulled back to regroup, a hail of crossbow bolts erupted from the Crusader formation. At 50 yards, a crossbow bolt could pierce chainmail like paper. In just 30 seconds, 80 elite Mamluks lay dead or dying. Baldwin himself, ravaged by his disease, collapsed from his horse in the middle of the battle. His bodyguards caught him before he could hit the ground, but even from a stretcher, the Leper King continued to command the battle. "Hold the line," he rasped. "Let them come to us." This was their key maneuver, the moving fortress. The pattern repeated itself. Muslim attacks came, the line bent but never broke. Withering crossbow volleys met the retreating enemy. The Turks' feigned retreats, designed to lure the knights into a chase, failed completely. Not a single knight broke formation, and the infantry stood firm. This iron discipline, born of desperation, proved stronger than centuries-old stratagems. Then Baldwin issued an order that shocked both armies. The Iron Hedgehog began to advance. This was not a swift attack, but a methodical, synchronized advance. Step by step, this moving fortress of steel and determination rolled forward across the plain. Imagine the sound, the rhythmic clang of armored feet and the rustle of thousands of pikes reflecting the morning light. The psychological effect was devastating. The Muslim cavalry, accustomed to mobile, fluid combat, now faced an inexorably advancing living wall. This led to a psychological collapse, a brutal meat grinder. Saladin, seeing that traditional tactics were failing, gave a decisive order. "Full assault! All cavalry divisions!" 8,000 horsemen surged forward in the largest cavalry charge of the Third Crusade era. The ground shook with such force that people inside Belvoir Castle swore the very walls were trembling. The sensory overload was deafening. Dust clouds rose 100 feet into the air, thousands of horses screamed, and steel clashed against wood. The Crusader line vanished into a maelstrom of horses, dust, and violence. But the Iron Hedgehog wouldn't break. It flexed like a living thing. As the Muslim cavalry crashed into one section, that part of the line would pull back, and the adjacent sections would shift inward like closing doors. Instead of breaking through, the attacking cavalry found themselves funneled into narrow kill zones, where crossbow bolts rained down from three sides onto dense masses of riders. At point-blank range, the devastation was absolute. A Templar knight later wrote, "The Saracens fell like wheat before the scythe. Their magnificent cavalry, the pride of Islam, died pressed against our pikes, unable to advance or retreat." Within 20 minutes, 400 Muslim horsemen were killed or lay dying. Saladin, witnessing the catastrophic losses, ordered his 12,000 horse archers to fire at their maximum rate, 30,000 arrows a minute, a literal rain of steel that blotted out the sun. The Crusaders transformed into a living turtle shell, each man covering himself and his neighbor. Arrows fell with such density that their shields resembled hedgehogs. But the Hedgehog continued its relentless advance despite the falling warriors. The final act, retreat, was impossible. From his command hill, Saladin made an instant, ruthless calculation. His army had lost 2,000 killed against only 180 Crusaders. The casualty ratio was catastrophic. Worse yet, his army's morale was crumbling. Warriors who had conquered lands from Egypt to Syria were being systematically decimated by a force they outnumbered by 40 to 1. "Sound the retreat," Saladin commanded. His emirs protested, pointing to their overwhelming numerical superiority. But Saladin saw what they did not. The Iron Hedgehog could be defeated, but at what cost? To lose 10,000 men just to kill 750? Such a victory would be meaningless. The retreat was masterful, controlled, and disciplined, preserving both their dignity and their strength. The Muslim cavalry withdrew in stages, continuing to harass the enemy to prevent pursuit. The infantry covered their rear. When the Muslim horns sounded the retreat, the Crusaders did the impossible. Baldwin ordered, "Hold your ground." There would be no pursuit. The exhausted Crusaders watched their tormentors withdraw, too weary even to cheer. Knights collapsed where they stood. Foot soldiers leaned on their bloodied pikes. The Iron Hedgehog finally dissolved into exhausted humanity. They had won. But what was the true cost of this incredible victory? And what terrifying consequences would it bring? This was a turning point, a Pyrrhic victory. The victory at Belvoir, so stunning and improbable, was a tactical triumph, yet at the same time a strategic disaster. It was a turning point that forever changed the course of the war and relentlessly accelerated the fall of the Kingdom of Jerusalem. Indeed, the Crusaders held on to their fortresses and their army. Their strategic objective had been achieved, but Saladin was not defeated. He had been taught a lesson. And Saladin's lessons from this encounter can be categorized into several key areas. After Belvoir, Saladin didn't stop. He immediately continued his campaign, demonstrating incredible energy and strategic foresight. First, he besieged Beirut, attempting to cut the kingdom off from the sea. Then, the following year, he laid siege to Aleppo and secured its capitulation, consolidating his growing empire from the Nile to the Euphrates. The balance of power decisively shifted in his favor. The Crusaders, who seemed to have achieved victory, watched as their enemy grew stronger and more dangerous than ever. The Battle of Belvoir clearly demonstrated that concentrated Crusader forces using the Iron Hedgehog formation could defeat much, vastly larger Muslim armies. This was a crucial realization. However, this concentration demanded a huge sacrifice. It meant exposing garrisons and leaving vast territories defenseless against raids. Saladin, despite suffering a tactical defeat, learned a harsh but invaluable lesson. He understood that he didn't need to attack the Iron Hedgehog head-on. This revealed the Kingdom of Jerusalem's Achilles' heel. Saladin inflicted immense, irreparable damage on the countryside. His raiders turned 60 Christian villages to ash. This was not mere devastation, it was the systematic destruction of the kingdom's economic foundation. Frankish feudal lords relied on rent from their tenants, but the ravaged peasants could no longer pay. Without that income, the lords couldn't maintain their soldiers, hire mercenaries, or even keep their castles in repair. Saladin realized the Crusaders had to be starved out. Their economy, not their army in the field, was their primary vulnerability. This marked the birth of economic warfare in its medieval form, a precursor to asymmetric conflict, where a weaker yet more flexible opponent exhausts a stronger one without direct confrontation. This brings us to the modern day and a lesson for the ages. The brilliant and heroic victory at Belvoir exposed a fatal strategic trap. Winning a field battle required concentrating their forces, but this inevitably meant leaving garrisons dangerously exposed. This also left the kingdom's economy critically vulnerable to Saladin's systematic, devastating raids. Ultimately, this led to its unrelenting destruction. Saladin, though he lost the battle, won the war in the long run. He no longer sought pitched battles with concentrated Crusader forces. Instead, he forced them to defend everywhere at once, launching raids in one place, posing threats in another, besieging isolated castles, and burning even more villages. The Kingdom of Jerusalem began to bleed out from 1,000 cuts. Modern military historians recognize Belvoir as a precursor to modern asymmetric warfare. The weaker side achieved a tactical victory thanks to outstanding cohesion and innovative tactics. But strategic victory always belongs to the power that can sustain operations in the long term. Saladin could replenish his losses. Baldwin could not. It is this lesson, learned at Belvoir, that will unlock the rest of the story. This history lesson is about tactics versus strategy. The genius of the dying king Baldwin IV and the unprecedented iron discipline of his troops at Belvoir allowed them to achieve the absolutely impossible. They stood their ground against overwhelming odds, rewriting the rules of medieval warfare. But even the greatest tactical victory cannot save a kingdom if it cannot sustain its economy and maintain its strategic defense in the long term. The Iron Hedgehog was the pinnacle of tactical innovation, centuries ahead of its time, foreshadowing the Swiss pike squares and Spanish tercios. It was a deadly combination of pike squares, integrated missile units, and the ability to launch lightning-fast counterattacks. But its effectiveness critically depended on highly disciplined, professionally trained troops, which the Crusader states simply could not sustain amidst constant attrition. The Battle of Belvoir showed that even the most formidable war machines could be worn down by a strategy of attrition. Saladin, though tactically defeated, won strategically. He learned to exploit the enemy's economic vulnerability, realizing that to defeat the Iron Hedgehog, he didn't need to attack it, he simply needed to starve it. The final act, the cost of victory. And that's exactly what he did. 5 years later, in 1187, Saladin put every lesson he'd learned from Belvoir into practice at the fateful Battle of Hattin. He forced the Crusader army away from their water sources, wore them down with constant debilitating raids, and then delivered a crushing blow when their formation finally faltered. The kingdom that had seemed invincible at Belvoir collapsed in a single day. Consider what this means for understanding military history. Sometimes winning every battle guarantees you lose the war. The tactical genius of the Crusaders at Belvoir, their incredible triumph, taught their enemy the very strategy that would ultimately destroy them. This victory carried within it the seeds of their ultimate defeat. The dying king Baldwin IV, who defied 30,000 warriors, achieved a victory that would echo through eternity, but doomed his kingdom within 5 years. Baldwin IV himself died in 1185, his body finally consumed by disease. He never knew that his greatest triumph had actually ensured the expulsion of Christians from Jerusalem. The era of chivalric, heroic warfare ended in a single day at Belvoir. It was replaced by a harsher calculus: economics over heroism, attrition over glory, strategic patience over tactical brilliance. Saladin realized to defeat the Iron Hedgehog, he didn't need to attack it, he needed to starve it. And in 1187, he did just that, forever changing the fate of the Holy Land.